Do. I think we're and we're live. All right, good stuff. I think we're on. I always like to give it a second. Hey everybody, happy Wednesday. Jordan here from Disrupt. It is 2:03 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we are going to get going in a couple minutes. Before we do, and while we're waiting for people to come online, just a couple housekeeping comments. So we are back this week, obviously, for Webinar Wednesdays. We took a week off, but we're stoked to be back. After this week, it looks like we're going to be changing the time of it to Thursday afternoons, exact time to be determined, and we are doing it simply because we've realized that Wednesdays at 2 p.m. aren't the best for many, many people. And so Callie reached out and said, hey, what's the best time? And across the board, we heard Thursday afternoons for the most part. So more on that later over email. Without any further ado, just want to make sure that the tech is good. For those of you that are in the room right now, can you hear me? Do I sound okay? You can just type yes and hey or whatever in the comment box. That would be very helpful just to make sure we're good to go. All right. Emily says she can hear. Anyone else? Emily can always hear because she has amazing abilities. While Emily spoke up first, all right, Angie can hear, love it. So another announcement while we're sitting here and waiting just for a couple more people to join. Emily is a new hire of Disrupt. We're really excited to have her. She's the first one that commented there. She's our new director of operations between both Disrupt, our company, and Shift, of which Jacob is a member of as well. So This is going to be awesome. So look, guys, let's dig right into this, and I'm going to hand this over to Jacob in a second. I'm really excited that Jacob is here with us for a couple of reasons. One is that from the first time that I met Jacob, I felt this very awesome calmness, and that he was one of the best listeners I have ever experienced in my life. And so I'm very excited to do the listening for once during this webinar. But beyond that, he is an amazingly gifted social worker and therapist that's part of the team here at Shift that is doing all sorts of wonderful work, both within his full-time day job where he works with families and kids, but also in his private practice as well, where he helps mostly people reconcile transitions and helps them be unapologetic about it. Just a fantastic person, just so excited he could join us. He's also joining the Disrupt roster too, where we're gonna get him out and doing some speaking in the post-secondary high school market, the middle school market, and certainly the college university space as well too. So we'll share more on that later. Last thing I wanna share about Jacob is one of the first things, I think even before I met you, Jacob, I think Megan had shown me the piece from Huffington Post that you had written that was then posted and shared by Huffington Post. And it just tell us a little bit about it, Jacob, and then we'll get into a formal intro.
Yeah, for sure. So can everyone hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just hearing an echo.
Oh, here. That's me. That's me. Here.
Okay. Okay, there we go. So basically, I wrote an article for Huffington Post, and it was I shared it across a couple of my networks, and then it went viral. And it was a really surreal experience. Like, got all these messages from all over the world, from people just kind of being like, "Hey, that experience resonates with me. That's something that I've experienced." And so I think that people just want to see themselves on paper. People want to see themselves, represented. And I think that people want their stories told. So.
Well, I think you're being modest, though, Jacob. I mean, like, how many shares did that thing get?
Oh, geez. What is the number now? I think it is at 500,000.
Yeah. 500,000 people sharing that to Facebook. So very clearly, the things that you talk about resonate. And you're also the only person that I've met organically through life that shared a bit of that viral experience. So we got to exchange more notes on that one. But without any further ado, again, guys, I'm really stoked that Jacob's here with us. I'm going to go off camera and hand it over to him. Jacob, if you need anything during at all, I'm right here. So just speak up and I'll pipe in. But otherwise, take it away. Feel free to introduce us to you. And we look forward to learning from you for the next 45 minutes or so.
Excellent. So I'm going to introduce myself in just a second. First, I just want to hear from you where you guys are from. Maybe you can just type in the comments. I'm gonna cast my presentation here. I just have to push this button. If you could just tell me where you're from, that would be great.
Oh, the button. So you go up to the top of your window.
Can you see it?
And then you hit. There's a little share button. I'm just rearranging the windows here as I get off. You'll see a little share button when you scroll over.
Yep, I see it.
Perfect. So then you just click on that. There we go. And I'm going to turn off my camera now.
Excellent.
All right, man. Rock it out.
Cool. So if everyone could just push, tell us where you're from, that kind of stuff. I haven't seen any comments load yet, but I'm going to load this. Okay. Okay, cool. So I'm going to talk today about how to figure out who you are while managing new transitions. So basically what that means is that, sorry, there's an echo here in this perspective. There. Sorry, I think we're good now. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about how to manage new transitions, especially during when you're figuring out who you are. So if we just start off, this who am I question, right? This is a question that I've asked myself so many times, and this is something that I think it's a question that we have to constantly ask ourselves. And so my name is Jake. As Jordan said, I'm a social worker, but I'm also a therapist. I'm a writer, I'm a speaker. As you see there, those all have periods at the end of those sentences, and that's because those are statements that I made about myself, and those are things that I figured out. That's who I am, and so right now in this period of time, in this current environment that I'm a part of, I'm a therapist, I'm a writer, I'm a speaker. I'm also, I think I'm really funny, so I might be interspersing some jokes in here, but I'm also stubborn, I'm also steadfast in my beliefs, and I'm also not willing to apologize for being who I am. So hopefully we'll get a chance to explore more of these kinds of ideas and throughout this talk. So we're going to start just by talking about the self and what the self means. So basically, the self is comprised of these four things you see on the side here. So that's self-concept, self-knowledge, social self, so who you are in social situations, and then also self-esteem. Self-esteem basically are just the beliefs that you hold about yourself. And so those ideas are largely shaped by biology, genetics, what the scientific community would call nature, and then also the environmental pieces and the social pieces, political, that kind of stuff is what the other communities would call nurture. And so we have this debate of nature versus nurture, and it's actually shown that it's actually both that contribute to who the self is. For the purposes just of this talk, I'm going to talk about the social pieces because I think that these are the pieces that really create the stories of ourselves, and these are the pieces that we're actually in control of, and these are the pieces that we can change. And I think that these are the parts that, based on where we grew up and what our experiences are, that's how we create the story of our lives. And I'm just going to take you back just a little bit. When I first was writing the post that went viral, that was actually during my master's, and that was at a time when the story that I was telling myself was not the most positive one. I was really scared. I transitioned into school, especially a grad program. Like, it was super hard, right? And so the story I was telling myself in those moments were that I didn't belong. I shouldn't be there. People know so much more than me. People have so much more experience. And the truth is that none of that was true. And that was just purely the story that I was telling myself. So that was based on the set of experiences that I had. And so what social researchers call that is lived experience. And so that's what I'm going to expand upon here. And our environment determines our unique lived experience. Everybody has different lived experiences, and just based on these ideas here that you see below. So it's gender, race, sexual orientation, cultural and historical experiences. All those ideas come and shape who we are. And so they also shape how we understand ourselves, how we understand others, and how we also understand the world, right? And so if you just take a step back and kind of just think about that question that I asked myself at the very beginning, who am I? If you could just take a second to think about who am I? What is it that, what pieces of me, what experiences do I have that form together to create who I am? And it's through these lived experiences that we write the stories about ourselves. So in many ways, it's the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, right? And so I know that's like kind of a silly concept, or an interesting concept actually. And really what we're talking about is all those little pieces from our environment that we're just gathering and pulling and taking in to tell ourselves the story of who we are. So that's going to be the basis of what we're going to be talking about today. I think it's really helpful if we define the self, because we don't know who the self is under construction or during change and transition if we don't actually define what that is and what that means for a lot of people. So I know I just spit a whole bunch of stuff at you. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of condense it into 3 bullet points right here. The story we tell ourselves is shaped by what I think I am. So the story that I tell myself. So if you think back to the example I gave earlier, the story that I was telling myself when I was undergoing a huge change in my life, which was starting a new school program. The story that I was telling myself, that was largely determined who I was in that moment. The second one is what people think I am. So the stories that other people tell about me. So in that category could very well be all those stories that Jordan was telling about me, right? And so when I hear all that information, I'm taking all that in and I'm building myself based on that. I'm writing my story about myself just based on what someone like Jordan has to say about me. And this last one, it's kind of a little bit tricky, but it is what I think people think I am, right? So it's the story that other people tell me and what I value that story to be, right? So let's just take an example for, so when I was in probably grade 7 or 8, I was giving a presentation, and I remember hearing these boys in the back of the classroom just laughing and snickering. Whatever they were laughing at, I'm not sure. I interpreted that to mean that they were laughing at me. So all of those shame stories associated with that and how I interpret what that behaviors were of the other people, that's what we're talking about here. What I think people think that I am. So in that moment, I was appraising those situations as people are judging me, and I experienced that shame. And so now, moving forward in my life, I carry all that shame and all those shame stories with me. And so for me, at this point in my life, in 2017, I still carry all those pieces of my grade 7 self with me. And that very much shapes who I am, right? And it shows up every single time I give a presentation, for example, or every time someone like snickers in the background, right? And so that might be a moment where the story that I tell myself, it could get thrown off kilter there. But so that's what we're talking about when we talk about the stories that we tell ourselves. So now we're going to piece apart the self and then identity. Okay, so these are 2 distinct ideas. And so if you take a look at this lovely diagram right here of this, what looks like a person, we're going to call all those little floating bits around there, that's our environment. And so that is our self. So if you think back to earlier, all the pieces of ourself are based on our environment, right? So it's all the things that happen to us. So that could be all the mean comments someone said about us, all the good things, the nice things, the helpful things I tell myself, the hurtful stories I tell myself, all my traumatic experiences. And then, of course, all of the values and preferences and opinions that come from just being a body in my environment, right? And so identity then, if we look at the self as just a sponge and all these things are floating around us, identity is all those stories that we choose. So we're going to be picking apart all these pieces, and we're going to be evaluating them. We're going to say, yep, that's me. Oh, that's not me. So part of my identity is all the stories that I use to define who I am. So I might take that experience, that really harmful experience in me being a grade 7, and in saying, yeah, that's who I am. Like, I'm someone that is worthy of shame. I'm someone that doesn't do well with judgment, right? And those are pieces of myself that I'm now carrying forward to my identity, right? And so as our environment changes, so do the stories that we tell ourselves. So what this means is that wherever you're going, wherever you are in life, when you experience change, which by definition, change and transition, they're new experiences, so do the stories that we tell ourselves, right? So what we're going to talk about in this webinar is how we tell how we tell ourselves stories about ourselves. That's the first thing. But then we're also going to talk about how we tell ourselves new stories when the stories that we're telling ourselves aren't working, or aren't helpful, or are getting us really stuck. Because I think that we've all been there, and I think that that's a universal human experience. I think that being in those really hard moments, it's not a fun experience, it's not a comfortable experience, but I think that we've all been there, and I think that everyone knows that struggle, and I think that that struggle is to be human. I think that all that pain in those really hard times, that's a human experience that we all experience. And what makes it so challenging, though, is that because it's so hard and because it's so challenging, that it's really hard to figure out who you are. And so, ultimately the goal is to be secure in yourself and confident and have this great self-esteem, but that's so much easier said than done, and it really is hard to know who you are. I'm just gonna take a drink of water. And I think part of what makes it so hard as well is that we have all these messages. So we have messages of, love yourself, be yourself, take care of yourself, know your worth, play within your boundaries, set boundaries for yourself. And that's really hard, right? And so there's these two expectations, that is, you have to know yourself, but then also you have to get to know yourself, right? And you have to love yourself, but you also have to get to know to love yourself, right? And so I have some questions. I think it's really important that we lay our questions out there and we make them very clear. So the question I have is, how do you love yourself and take care of yourself when you don't know who you truly are? How do you love yourself and get to know yourself when our environments are constantly changing, right? And how do you know who you are, especially during periods of really big moments of change and transition? Like I said before, by definition, change and transition, those are new moments, right? These are new experiences. So of course it's going to be hard. And of course, during these moments is when, our toughest experiences come from, right? And so I want you to think right now just about yourself. I want you to think, who am I during periods of really big transition? Like, am I really anxious, or am I calm, cool, collected? Am I content? And then when things start to get heavy, that's kind of when I explode, or that's kind of when it goes over the top for me. So I want you to think about who I am when I'm going to a new job. Answer that for yourself right now. Who are you when you're going to a new school, right? These are questions that I have for myself, and I know a lot of people have for themselves, but rarely get the chance to actually think about it and ask themselves. I would not be shocked if your response to that question is, who are you when you're going to a new job, or who are you when you go to school, or what pieces of yourself do you show when you're going to a new classroom? I wouldn't be shocked if those answers are, I don't know, or, it's just based on the moment. Moment to moment, it's different. And so what we're going to talk about today is how we create identities and cultures and communities of safety around what our identity is and what that can mean for us in the future moving forward. Because we're going to constantly experience change, and we're going to constantly experience transition. And like I said, change and transition is always a new experience. And so it's not like we have a roadmap from the past that we're using to, figure this thing out. Every step we take forward and every new change we have, we're writing the roadmap, right? And it's a new set of skills that we have to use. So that's what we're going to talk about right now. When we answer that question, who am I during change and transition? This is the stuff that comes out. It comes out of my experience as a therapist. It comes out of my experience as a writer. It comes out of my experience as, someone who's just navigating this world and trying to figure out which story to tell myself about myself. And I am not immune to any of these ideas here. I think that media influences our opinion. There's so many other influences, and we all have those thoughts, right? Of like, I'm not good enough, or who am I during these really tough moments? I think that we're all self-conscious. We all have low self-esteem. Our self-image is always kind of floating in there. And I think that the body image thing is a lot more pervasive than we even think about or even want to talk about. And I think that that's super harmful. But that's not what this talk is about. That's for another time. But so really what we're talking about here is how do we understand ourselves when these are the stories that we constantly tell ourselves. And so just a few words I'm going to float out here. In the top left corner, we have the fixed view of self. And I'm going to define that in just a moment. But in the very bottom right-hand corner, we have this whole idea of be yourself, love yourself. And then a lot of society is like, no, not like that. You can be yourself, know yourself, but you need to be more like this. We like you better when you're like this. And that's an experience that I know to be so true. Growing up in a very small town in a space that wasn't really designed for gay folks, and for me, understanding my sexual identity in those spaces was really challenging. I think that the stories that community told about themselves was a certain thing, and my story was very different. The story in my experience is we're not in line at all with what the community was telling themselves. And conversely, what I was telling myself, right? And who I knew how to be in that space, but then also like how I knew to cope with being so different, right? And so really the story that I constructed about myself was that I'm going to be me and I'm not willing to apologize. And that is an example of where, you're caught in that moment of like, you have a choice to make. It's like, I'm going to stay here and I'm going to, suffer in any form of the word, whatever that means. But, or I have the option. I can grow from it or I can learn from it. And so figuring out who we are is hard work. It is very, very hard. And I don't want to take anything away from how hard it is to actually look at yourself, to actually be in that space with yourself and to like actually reconcile like, oh, this is who I am. This is what it means to be unapologetically Jake, right? And it's really hard, but we need to talk about it. And that's how we fix it. And I use fix in the sense of not that it's a problem, but in the sense of we need to be able to fix it in order to grow from it, right? And we need to address it in order to move on. So that's what we're talking about. If we're talking about stepping forward and moving forward, then this is what we're talking about, despite how hard it is, right? So the way that I've broken it down is we are going to label two types of identities. I've already talked about one briefly, but I'm going to define them in just a sec. I just wanted to say quickly too that part of what this means as well is we're not talking about identity based on like a social research type of identity, right? There's all these different identity traits and all that kind of stuff. That's not what we're talking about. We're actually creating a story about identities, and what we're doing together is we are, just laying some truth to what it is to be human and what it is that we experience. So the way that I've categorized it is into two. The first one is fixed identity, and the second one is fluid identities. And so at any time, we can all occupy all of these types of identities. So the first one is fixed identity. So this means that the stories that this person tells about themselves are forever, and the stories do not change. So someone with a fixed identity pattern is someone who says, I can't do that. There's no way I'm going to do that. Or I only learn by watching. I know myself. I only learn by watching. Or someone who's like really self-defeating and says, I'll never be good enough. I can't do it. I'm not lovable. I'm not worth it. And these are stories that we can all relate to, right? And so we all occupy fixed identity patterns, from time, because that's also how we come to understand the world. And so if we kind of break it down into just some images here, just for the visual learners, if we break it down, the self is just comprised of a bunch of little photographs. So if you lay all the photographs out on a table, you say, I like cats, I like dogs, I also like mustard on my hot dogs, but I don't like ketchup. It's just little snapshots of your life, and it goes all the way back to childhood. So it's like, I didn't learn math easily. I suck at math, for example. So it's all just the collection of the little snapshots of the stories that we're telling ourselves. So someone with a fixed identity has that very narrow view of who they are and what it means to be full or whole or themselves. And so conversely, we also have the fluid identity. So someone with a fluid identity pattern is characterized by the stories that the stories they tell themselves are constantly changing in the context of their environment or their experience. So it's very fluid, right? So if you look at the very bottom photo there, it's kind of like a film reel, right? And so they're all connected, they're all together, but they're very much on this trajectory of moving forward and not separate. They're very much informed by the past and the history and all that comes before them. So it does require that you have a compassionate understanding of yourself. And so really what we're talking about here is finding a way to understand who you are in the context of your changing environment, but then also knowing that you are the product of your history, right? And so a lot of research in the past has said that children and people are blank slates. And so people start out with nothing and they just learn and grow and stack a bunch of stuff on top of that. We know that's not true now. So what we know now is that actually people are the products of their environment, which is even just long before someone's born. So all of that kind of stuff just builds who you are. And so you're not gonna like, pull a Taylor Swift and kill yourself off. You're not saying like, hey, no, that's no longer who I am. I'm a new person. No, you are bringing all that with you. So like right now, as I sit here and talk to you, grade 7 Jacob is sitting right here beside me, right? He's really scared. He feels really shame when people laugh at him, but he's coming with me. I'm bringing all my selves with me in order to really build that really constantly changing fluid identity about myself. This also allows me to be able to sit here and sit here in my truth, right? And be completely compassionate about where I've been and how far I've come. This allows us to really grow and just allows us to really move forward. And so I'm talking to 15-year-old me, someone whose father just passed away, and someone who really didn't have any roadmap for what manhood looked like, or for what fatherhood might look like beyond a 15-year-old. So I'm bringing all that knowledge with me, and leaving any of that in the past. Compassionate understanding piece, because it's a lot easier said than done. Sorry, harder. It's a lot harder. So we can just have some examples here, because I think it's really helpful if we just kind of piece this thing apart. So if you look at self-identity and your fluid identity, in relation to mental health and well-being, fluid identity would be characterized by self-confidence, ability to bounce back, strength of mind, positive thinking, mental reassurance, and strength of character. So that's kind of like the ideal. I think that's a lot less realistic than I think it now. I think that we all have our ups and downs. And I think that we need to be more compassionate and kinder in our expectations of ourselves. And I think that sets the bar really high. But I think that we need to just kind of open it up, and everyone needs to be okay with not being okay. But so we have some examples here. Loosely, how we define it is who I am depends on the story I tell myself about myself during the most challenging times. So examples are, I'm worthless. Instead, a fluid identity pattern would have, right now I'm having a really hard time adjusting. It's a lot more realistic, and it gives you a lot more control over what that means for your future, right? I will always be a slow learner versus it will take me some practice in order to get better, right? It's a lot kinder to yourself, first of all, but then it's a lot more realistic, right? And it doesn't set yourself up for that really fixed identity pattern. I'm going to go back 2 slides because I want to just mention something here. When we look at the words that are underlined there, can't, only, and never, those are very forever type words, right? Those are very fixed words. They're very rigid. They're very black and white, and so it doesn't leave any wiggle room or room for improvement. And so if we're a little bit kinder in our expectations about who we are and who we can be, then these are the examples that we can take from that. So last one here, no one understands me. Raise your hand if you've ever experienced that, because I know I sure have, especially during my most challenging moments, especially figuring out who I am. And, in that small town, coming out as gay, I was like, I don't know who I am. No one understands me, right? If I stay in that belief, and while it may have been very true for me in that moment, that could be very real for me, right? So no one understands me. But right now that I'm older, wiser, and all that kind of stuff, I'm able to look back on it and then talk to myself and reconcile with my 14-year-old self who was trying to figure all that out. And now I can tell him my current friend group just had different experiences than I do, right? My community was just a very different world that I was living in, right? And they didn't understand me, and maybe that was true, and maybe they still don't. And that's something that is a different topic, but we can reconcile all of the really hard truths, and it really just depends on the story that you tell yourself, right? So fluid identity, those are also very much characterized by these 4 traits right here. So just being flexible, so being able to adapt well to change, being able to just move on really quickly. When you're managing a new transition, it is on your side if you're able to just be really flexible, right? But also you have to have realistic expectations of yourself. That also means that you're setting very firm boundaries and saying, you know what, this isn't realistic for me right now. I'm going to be as flexible as I can be, but it's not going to happen, right? So finding the courage to stand alone and finding the courage to say no, that is one of the most biggest challenges that I've had, is just being able to stand alone in my beliefs and being able to set those boundaries and say no. But that means that if that's the boundaries that I have about myself, and this is how I belong to myself, and this is how I create stories about myself, then you have to have that belief about flexibility and then also expectations for yourself, because that can only allow us to be more open-minded, right? And so that's the next one, is just being open-minded and not being so fixed and so stuck in the moment of, this is never going to work out for me. This is the end, right? Those are very concrete statements about what your future looks like, and you don't know because it hasn't played out yet, right? So being completely open-minded and coping well with change, those are totally really helpful for dealing with change. And so coping well with change, that's a lot easier said than done, folks. That is really, really hard. So coping well with change, that's things like managing our anxieties, telling ourselves helpful statements during really tough times. Those are hard tasks, right? And knowing when to take a break, that's another way that we can cope with change. But they're really hard because that requires all these other things to be true, is that you have to be flexible, you have to be open-minded, you have to be realistic in your expectations for yourself. So for the next 10 minutes, I want to just spend some time talking about the concrete takeaways, how you actually build a fluid identity and how you apply that to moments of change and transition. So how do you rewrite the story of yourself while also going under change and transition and experiencing all these new things? So it's all about how do you take steps forward and how do you continue to write that story and that narrative about yourself while it's still really, really challenging. The first one is practice self-compassion. This one is so incredibly important. I'm going to give you a little example here. The story that I used to tell myself when I was probably around 21, when I was first transitioning into university, it was really scary. I was super overwhelmed, in a new space. A lot of like peer pressures coming into it with, like alcohol and drugs and that kind of stuff. And so I was in this new program. I was in neuroscience, and I was so excited about science. I was like, yes, science is my jam. I really want to be in that space. And then I got there and I realized, like, this isn't where I want to be, and these courses aren't really what I want. So what ended up happening was that I thought I could wait out the semester, and so what ended up happening was I ended up getting really low marks in a few of my courses. And so I was so hard on myself because previously the story that I told myself was that I was smart. I could hold it together. I deal well with transitions. I know how to keep it together. I'm good at school, so I had that to fall back on at least. And during that moment is when, a really vulnerable time when I'm like, shoot, like I am getting really low grades here. And I could have really benefited from some self-compassion. So a really big takeaway for you right now, I want you to talk to yourself as if you're talking to a dog who's learning a new trick or a baby who's learning how to walk. I know it's an interesting concept, but I want you to practice self-compassion. Like we talked about how just by definition, change and transition is new. That means that you've never been there before and you've never done something before, right? So you're going into this new space. You are going to talk to yourself as if you're managing something for the first time, because you are. So you're going to talk to yourself like you're a baby learning how to walk, right? So you're like, you got it. You can do this. I know it's hard, but you can keep on trying, right? That's the kind of narrative, and that's a story that you want to cultivate around these really challenging moments. It's just being compassionate, and what that means is then also being kinder to yourself and being a lot more realistic in your expectations about what you have. The next one is feeling all your feelings. There was a point in my life where during transition, during change, all I would experience was what I labeled as anxiety. I labeled it as like my heart's racing, I'm getting sweaty, I'm just feeling anxious right now. And so that was the result of me not being able to fully feel all my feelings, right? And so I really was never able to piece apart, like, am I nervous? Am I embarrassed? Am I, am I sad? Maybe they were all true, right? And so labeling and feeling all of your feelings is really, really, really important. That was at a point in my life where I didn't know the difference between emotions and feelings. That's a time for another discussion, but I didn't know like what that meant. And so for me to finally feel all my feelings, that is something that I've just been able to really adjust well to new transitions. And it's funny how Jordan says that the story that he tells is that I'm really calm, and I've heard that story about myself before, but internally that's not the story that my body's telling me. So it's also just really interesting how the stories that we construct about ourselves really do shape the outcomes, right? Talking to your former self, this is kind of what I talked about before. I'm bringing everybody with me. I'm not, killing off former pieces of me and rising from the ashes as this like new person. I'm bringing everybody with me. I want everybody to have a seat at the table. I want everybody to be in the writer's room with me as I construct the story of my future. I want all of my past selves. I want my little mischievous little kid in me to be like, I want to sit at the table because those are the pieces of me that make me, right? If I leave all those people behind, then they don't get to have a seat, and then that means that I'm not my full self moving forward, right? It doesn't mean that I'm going to be super mischievous moving forward. It just means that I understand who that person was and what their struggles were, and that means that I'm bringing them forward and we're growing together, right? And so we're all building and we're all moving forward together. Another really good one is to dive into the uncomfortable. That goes along with the next point, which is try something new. My clients actually, they get mad at me when I tell them that we learn the most during our most uncomfortable moments, and people don't like hearing that. That's not a story that people like hearing, but it really is true. When we are in our most uncomfortable state is when we're our most vulnerable. That's when people learn the best, and that's when people grow the most, right? You can be as comfortable as possible. I'm all for challenge by choice. However, you're just not going to see as much change if you're not just jumping right into it. And that's something that's a struggle. I still struggle with that today, for sure. Next one, ask questions. It's really, really important that you take a look at the story you're telling yourself and then kind of assess like what pieces of the self and my environment am I taking to create my identity. While you're doing that, it's important to ask questions because you need to be able to push things away and say, nope, that's not me. Oh, that's interesting that you thought that was me, but that's not me. And so while that is very challenging, it's really, really hard to figure out who you are amidst all this transition. So that's why it's also important to take breaks. Knowing when to take breaks is one of the hardest things as well, because it really depends on so many different aspects of your health, right? We're talking about mental health, physical health, all that kind of stuff. There's this huge, big push for self-care now, and I think it's really great. And that's the hardest piece. People say, take care of yourself, but then we never talk about how. We never talk about how we actually should be taking breaks, right? These are the last three that I have. The next one is own your stories and dare to write new ones. I think that's self-explanatory. You're going to do what feels right and do not apologize for being your true self. Also self-explanatory. And then also the last one, I think breathe is the most important thing that you can do, because it has actually been found that breathing just is the remote control that completely resets your body. It is quite astonishing, actually. And I'm going to teach you how I breathe in just a second, but it really has been shown to just completely gather all the anxieties and just like really release it. And so by definition, change and transition, it's new. So it's very anxiety provoking. It's really challenging. And so one thing that you can do in the moment is just breathe. And so I'm going to take you through what that looks like right now. And so it's called square breathing. So if you take the palm of your hand and just trace out a square on your hand. So you're going to go in, out for the second square, and just keep on square breathing in for the first square and out for the second square. It really does center yourself and really does bring you back down to earth. That's a super helpful tool. All right, so what I've done here is I've captured just some of the how-tos. How do you actually build a fluid identity so that you can manage those transition and those changes a lot smoother? I'm going to leave you with one of my favorite quotes. I think it applies so much to what we talked about today. So it's, the world will tell you who you are until you start telling the world who you are. So you're going to bring all that past with you, and you're going to bring them all with you, and we're all going to march together in the army that you created for yourself. And so I'm going to leave you with this final question, and it's, what story are you going to tell the world about yourself? That is all I have for today. I'm just going to quickly exit out of here so that we can get straight to Q&A. I know that we have about 15 minutes left. Let's see. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to put it into the box below. Let's see here. Let's see. Okay, cool. Jordan, are you still there? I'm not sure what's happening here. Sorry guys. Jordan, are you still there?
Okay, can you hear me? Can
yes,
you hear
me? I can hear you now.
Amazing. Sorry, my laptop's slow. Okay, I have a bunch of questions for you while we're waiting for anyone else to ask any questions.
I love it.
My first question is this. You touched on it a little bit in the beginning, but how common is this? I mean, obviously, we all experience change and transition every day in some way, shape, or form. But how common is it that you find people aren't asking themselves these questions or doing the work to resolve some of them? And also, how common do you think this need is for this discussion?
Great questions. I think it is so common. I would actually capture it as painfully common. It is probably the number one thing that I experience from people saying that I don't know who I am, and I would say it's probably the number one contributors to poor mental health outcomes, is not knowing who you are, and then also not knowing how to fully understand yourself in the context of your changes and in your transition. So I think it's super common, and therefore it's super important to have these discussions. And I feel like we're not having the discussions enough. You know, we don't know who we are, and you know, even as like, if you look at like our Canadian identity, for all the Canadians out there, we don't have a common identity, right? So this is not just for the individual; it is for any kind of collective community that you would consider yourself a part of.
Absolutely. Now, within that, what do you think campus leaders can do to create spaces for these conversations at schools? What would be either some activity ideas, event ideas, rituals, or even just simple, informal, but everyday things that we can each do to help foster this?
Great question. I would say the number one thing that people can do would be to show up. I would say that part of the problem is that people don't know how or don't want to show up for these conversations and create spaces for dialogues about how we can actually story and then restory our experiences about all these like pain and struggles that we experience. Because I think in so many ways we are addicted to our pain, but also loyal to the suffering in it. You know, I think that we're so attached to, you know, this is really hard and I'm okay with it being really hard because the alternative is it's too much for me. I can't go there. And so I think that showing up is probably the number one thing that you can do for your own mental health, but then also what campus leaders can do for their communities.
Mm. Okay, and one more, and this will be our last question. Unless anyone has any questions for Jacob, and I encourage you to reach out and ask, is very simply, I lost my train of thought for a second. I think one of the gaps is that, okay, so I heard about this course at Stanford once, the Design Your Life course, and there's now a book out by the same guys that teach the course all about lifestyle design. One of the gaps that I've seen in a lot of our training in colleges, in high school, in the workplace, whatever, is conversations around how we can design programming to build the self. And that's almost treated as this extracurricular kind of thing. And I wonder, from your experience, and especially working with kids, do you see more of these conversations happening within institutions at a younger age? And can we use that as maybe a sign of where the future is going to go? Like, do we think more of these conversations are going to be mainstream throughout our education system in the future?
I think that that is such a profound idea. I think that in terms of giving children social and emotional skills in younger, you know, as you're younger, I think is completely invaluable. I've in my work as well, I'm also in a lot of schools, so I get to see a lot of kind of what contemporary education looks like, and then also based on like what teachers are actually doing to make that happen. And so I can only speak to the experience of Toronto teachers in Canada. So but what I know is that there's a lot of people really embracing the transformative power of knowing yourself, but then also how to know yourself, right? And I think that really the common struggle for people is finding the language to do it. And I think that's why my article it resonated with so many people, was because it gave people language to their experience, and it gave people a story or a little bit of a roadmap for what they can expect for the future. And I think that if we can give kids that, if we can give kids language, and if we can give kids, you know, speak their experience into existence, I think that that's really powerful. And I think that that happens on multiple levels, right? Like across race and across gender and across class. I know that there's one school just around the corner from my house, actually. It's doing some really transformative work in like the gender area. And so what they do is they actually don't accept students based on any other marker other than like who you show up as. And that's actually the story that they tell like, you know, you're gonna come here and this is who you're gonna be. We're not separating you based on any other marker other than who you tell us you are. And I think that is incredibly powerful.
Is that a K-12 school?
It's actually an alternative school in the TDSB.
Oh wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, so they're already in that space. I think that, so like, to answer your earlier question, I think there's a lot of people that are in this space, but they just don't know how to flush it out. I think it's really.
Well, I think you touched on something really important, and I think it's something that we can all take away, is that sometimes we don't have the language to describe this disconnect. And it's very easy for us to think that we're broken or something is wrong with us, when in reality, we're all feeling this veil of stress of not being able to necessarily make sense of different sides. I mean, that was one of the things I learned through What's Your Big Lie? Using the concept of the big lie, I didn't understand it at the time, but it really resonated with people and still resonates with people, because it's like putting language around something that we intrinsically feel. I think that says a whole lot about how the mental health community has a lot of work to catch up to use nomenclature that is relevant and understandable in today's day and age.
I think that's a good point, because even if you look at something like the DSM and something that's like used to like, you know, label a set of behaviors related to your mental well-being. You're right. I think that a lot of the language that we currently have to define people's experiences is very inaccessible and it doesn't meet people actually where they're at based on the lived experiences of who they are, right? And I think that for us to, prescribe and diagnose just based on like what a human experience is and like what my body actually just does for me, and like how my body actually shows up based on what my experience is. I think that's really interesting. I think it's an interesting direction that we're going in, just in terms of, I think that like a lot of Eurocentric like values are ways of like, we want to categorize it, we want to label it, we want to put it into a box, right? And I think that this is an area that's so messy and it's so, I think it's so muddy, and I think that people's lived experiences are so diverse. Everyone has a different human experience, and I think that we're trying to put a bunch of things into boxes that don't always fit into a box or don't always need to be into a box.
Yep. And maybe that's okay that they don't fit in at all, as long as we can describe what we're experiencing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think there's so much power in the story, and actually one of my favorite quotes from Maya Angelou comes to mind, and it's that there's no greater agony there's no greater agony in the pain of an untold story, and I think that's so powerful because it's so true, right? I think that we all want to be heard. I think that we all want to be seen, and I think that we all, want to be able to put our authentic selves out there, but none of us want to define what authentic means and what authentic self actually looks like. And so for me, that's one of like my biggest areas of learning right now. I'm just kind of like diving into that. I'm like, well, wait, like what does it actually mean to like show up authentically, right? Like what does it actually mean to be unapologetic, right? Like these are just ideas, right? And it's a lot easier said than done, just like a lot of the other stuff I was talking about.
Hey, but we're, with your help, we're well on our way. Jacob, thank you so much for being here today with us. This is amazing. Thank you guys for showing up as well. A couple little housekeeping announcements here. We're of course going to post the replay later today on our YouTube channel. I encourage you to share it with anyone that you think may get a lot of value from what Jacob shared today, which is everyone. So please do share. Beyond that, please engage with us on our Facebook group. There's a link at the bottom of the screen here. It's our Brave Campus Facebook group. We have a lot of very exciting things coming up in the not so distant future. Now, I want to let you know that it does look like, again, we'll be moving our webinar time for next week. We will be in touch over email about that. Although right now it looks like it's going to be Thursday afternoons. If you have any thoughts on that, feel free to reach out to Callie or myself. It's just jordan@disrupt.com or Callie@disrupt.com, and we'll take it from there. Without any further ado, I just want to say again, and if you guys could join me in this by making a comment, thank you so much, Jacob, for sharing your story, your knowledge, and for being here with us today. In the middle of the workday at that, too. We really appreciate it.
For sure.
Your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm actually just going to type in the bar right now. I want to leave my social media handles, and that's also my website as well, mswjake.com. So if anybody wants to connect with me, I welcome any and all comments, and so let's connect. Cool.
And I should also mention too, guys, I mentioned it at the outset, but me being the poor businessman that I am, Jake is now being represented by Disrupt. We're going to be working to get him out into a variety of different academic institutions in the months ahead. So if you know any schools or communities, or if your school or community would benefit from Jake's message, feel free to send us a message and we can have a conversation about that as well too. There's a really important story that will resonate here, and we want to get it out to the world. So with that, thanks so much, guys. This has been a real pleasure. Jake, thanks again, buddy.
Yes, for sure. Thank you.
We will see you guys next week.
Take care.
Cool. Bye, guys. And shut up. See ya. Oh, now it's the awkward part. Okay, there we go. Just hang out.